without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our panel, and let's get the day rolling. I think the theme is best presented right up front, a question of balance.
Good morning. My name is Henry Sobonnet. I'm the director of the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budgeting. We have our great panel here. Kelly Brough from the Denver Metro Chamber, Elizabeth Gardner, our state demographer, Christian Reese, who's the executive director of Club 20, and Ann Terry, Colorado Special District Association. It's an honor to be with you here today, and Doug, thank you for the invitation. So I've prepared a few slides. The little clicker isn't working. So you all heard from some elected officials this morning, and I'm here to drag you through just a few PowerPoint slides. There will not be death by PowerPoint, I assure you. And just to give you a sense of how the numbers are working, but really the point of today's talk, and to keep maybe as a guiding question in your mind, is we have a very strict and hard to manage and hard to change rules-based system for our budgeting and spending in Colorado. A lot of it's in the Constitution, and a lot of it got in the Constitution a long time ago. And so here we are with a very healthy recovery, although it's slower than other recoveries. And we have differences in economic activity between the Front Range and other parts of Colorado. And so I think a guiding question you could keep in your mind as you listen to us today is, are these rules serving us for the goals we have or the state we want to have over the long run? It's not that they're bad or good. I think the question is more, are they working the way we want? So, let's see, I clicked. Can we go back to the very first slide? One more, please. There we go. Okay, so one of the roles of our office is to forecast the economy, and then we use that to project how much tax revenue is coming in. This chart kind of captures everything of the current moment. This is the leading and coincident economic indices for Colorado. Leading means they have some predictive value. Coincident means they're happening right now. So what we've done is we've moved the leading index 3 months ahead. Thank you. And you can see if the relationships between these two sets of data stay the same, the most reasonable outcome is that we should have some continued growth for 18 to 24 months. After that, forecasting turns into this big, wide hurricane path, and the confidence level goes way down. But if this relationship holds, we have some predictive value that we're in good shape for a little bit. Now, forecasting always has these caveats, big oh, by the ways. So, oh, by the way, we don't know what we don't know. So there might be a terrorist attack, there could be a natural disaster, there could be another financial crisis that we can't sleuth out right now. But without perfect knowledge about the future, our best guess right now is continued growth. One of the issues that's really interesting in Colorado is the ups and downs of the oil and gas sector. And this chart shows the drilling rigs in Colorado matched up with the price of West Texas Intermediate oil. So not surprisingly, the lower the price, the lower the economic activity in the oil and gas sector. So we endured in Colorado a very big drop in the oil and gas sector from 77 rigs down to about 16 rigs. And we're in a little bit of a bounce back, and this projection wheels off of about $50 a barrel. But the industry has become more efficient after the downturn. And so as rigs come back, the employment that was associated with rigs from before isn't the same. But what's really interesting about this chart, and I think our other panelists will touch on this, is The last time this happened at this magnitude in the early 1980s, it took the whole show down with it. During this downturn in the oil and gas sector, net in-migration to Colorado still was positive. Income taxes were still up. Sales taxes were still up, although very slow. So the resiliency, the diversification of Colorado's economy is very much a feature of the last downturn, and it's a feature of why people are optimistic about the future. Okay, so very quickly about the general fund budget. I hope when you go home you didn't hear the state budget came to complain about how much money the state has. The state budget director is not complaining about how much money the state has. The state budget director is asking the people at the Colorado Water Congress to keep in mind the context in which the state of Colorado has its money in the general fund. So when I say general fund, it's about 60% income tax and 30% sales tax. The rest, there's some miscellaneous. And this chart goes back to right before the dot-com implosion, 2001. So right after that, we had 5 years or so of flat or down. And then the middle of the 2000s, we all remember that, home equity loans were going to save the American economy. That didn't work out. So then we had the Great Recession and another 5 years of flat or down. And now we're in this amazing bounce back. What are the yellow line? What's the yellow line? What's the green line? The yellow line is if we adjust the amount of money we have for the number of people in the state and for inflation, we can decide we can see how much purchasing power we have relative to 2001 per capita, inflation adjusted in the pointy-headed speak. We're actually a little bit down. The recoveries have been slow. The recessions have been deep. A lot of people have been moving here. All the different things that go into this equation have kept the purchasing power about the same, even a little bit down. Same if we go from right before the Great Recession. Our purchasing power is just catching up per person. But when we have political debates, which starting point do you think we get to talk about? It's mostly true on Twitter. If you only had 140 characters, you would start at the lowest year, 6.4. And so if you use 6.4 as your baseline, we should have all the money in the world. In a bigger context, we are barely where we've been prior to the last two big drops. A side point to this, and this is something that's not well known, the dominant tax policy in the general fund for the state of Colorado over the last 20 years has been tax cuts. I'll say it again because you're not used to hearing it. The dominant tax policy in the general fund for the last 20 years has been tax cuts. The income tax rate was cut twice in the late 90s, early 2000s. The sales tax was cut. There was a thing called the senior homestead exemption put to the ballot in the year 2000. That's a property tax rebate that comes from general fund taxes, not from property taxes. And then the earned income tax credit a few years ago was made permanent. All in 2017, last full fiscal year, all of those added up to $900 million per year, every year. And we're collecting around $11 billion in the general fund right now. We don't even have the Tabor room under the limit to keep all that money. But that's another factor around this purchasing power and why can't the general fund do more for transportation. All of this affects what's happening right now. So where do we spend our money? Very quickly, that was money in the door, this is money out the door. And this relates to the rules in the Constitution. The big green slice there, if you can't read the script, K-12 education. So whatever doesn't come in from local property taxes, the state has to backfill from the general fund. The blue slice is the Medicaid program, and this is original Medicaid. The expanded Medicaid is paid for separately with this hospital provider fee you heard us talk about a couple years ago. It's not in the general fund. This is the original stuff, the original qualifications, and the impact from that is not the expansion in Obamacare, it's the demographics of the program, either elderly or people affected by the economy qualifying in for the program. As we go around the circle, human services, we don't hear much about it until something really bad happens, child welfare, developmental disabilities, the Mental Health Institute in Pueblo. All that stuff is the next slide up as we go clockwise. Public safety and courts. We're in kind of an interesting period right now. We're down over the last several years in prisoners, but we've also cut our capacity of available prison beds, and so we're bouncing back up just a little bit, and we're opening up a prison over the next year. Higher education, we subsidize resident undergraduate tuition for about 160,000 students statewide. This is the pie slice that has no toehold in the Constitution. There's no mandate to keep tuition low. There's no federal requirement. And so when we have recessions like the one we just talked about, we pull back on subsidizing resident undergraduate tuition, and that's why tuition, if you've paid attention or if you have kids in school, has gone up so much. And then everything else the state does is in the other slice. So it's just these big chunks of money financing operations around the state. Real quick, what's interesting about the green and the blue slice is probably about 500 state employees manage all that money, over 64% of the general fund budget. So it's school district employees, not state employees. And then when we buy health care through the Medicaid program, it's the private sector or not-for-profit health systems. So when the economy goes down, the employees to cut are prison guards, nurses at the state hospital, human services workers, or teachers in higher education. Complicated, you don't hear about it in the media, so I hope this has been helpful of how we spend our money. I've finally learned to include a marijuana slide. So this is our scheme right now of how marijuana taxes go. So contrary to what the advertising was in the ballot issue, it doesn't all go to schools. It's going exactly where the voters put it, but it was kind of very casually talked about as only going to schools. The excise tax on retail marijuana goes to a program called Building Excellent Schools Today. That's school construction. It doesn't go in the operating budgets. Anything over $40 million, though, we're putting in, for the moment, into the public school permanent fund. But we also have sales taxes on retail marijuana and on medical marijuana. And those are helping fund programs that are connected to the impact of marijuana. So a lot of prevention programs. We're doing a homeless housing program. Last year in the hospital provider fee fix bill, we're doing a little bit to reduce business personal property tax. So that's probably the biggest deviation the state has made away from just core kind of funding of the impact of legalization. The regulation of marijuana comes from the business fees, and then the sales tax on medical marijuana also goes into this tax cash fund and helps fund those programs. Let's see. Okay, school finance real quickly. So in the Constitution, we have spending increases and spending tax cuts at the same time. So the Gallagher Amendment, I know you heard about during breakfast. It's having another adjustment down in the projections. We're dealing with one right now. So the residential assessment rate applied to residential property is generating less than it would otherwise would. And the way the school funding works is the general fund has to fill back in and do more. So we keep track of another law in the Constitution, Amendment 23, which says you have to grow with enrollment and inflation, even if you don't have the money. So that's called now the Budget Stabilization Factor. I'll let you do the abbreviation of the first two letters on your own. It used to be called the negative factor, if you've heard us talk before. So we keep track of what the original law would have funded, kind of like telling your spouse all the chores you didn't do every night at dinner. So we remind the schools what they're not getting every year for some reason. And so that gap is around $750 million right now, and we're proposing to buy it down a little bit next year. One of the reasons we can't do as much for transportation in the general fund is the residential assessment rate is dropped once already, and it's going to drop again. And we have this constitutional mandate to fund enrollment and inflation in our schools. So it wasn't all good news in the general fund last December, and this is one of the reasons. So to real quick, so the green is the local property tax and public school trust fund. The blue and the gold are general fund sources. So what doesn't come in the green, the blue and the gold have to fill back up. Real quickly on Medicaid, on the left is the caseload by population, their composition. So individuals with disabilities, older adults, 65 and over, non-expansion adults, that's the green, that's the purple. Expansion adults, that's the Obamacare expansion. And then children, and then other. So then that's the composition by caseload. Now go over to the right, and then you can see their share of the budget. It's not the same. So 10% of the population is 42% of the money. So right now we're working on our next budget already. You know, we're already thinking ahead in the last one of the administration. So our final proposal will include a limit on the number of nursing home days people can have. I'm just kidding, just seeing if you're listening. Yeah, exactly. We're not doing that. So when people say Medicaid is why we can't have nice things, this is the chart that prevents any changes from happening. Okay, now, lastly on transportation, and I hope I'm still in the right amount of time for everybody else. So, I call this the yawning chasm of purchasing power. So, the gold line is the gas tax money that we've collected in the door. And this is all the way back to 1991, the last time the gas tax was adjusted. Who remembers what it is per gallon? Per gallon. Bueller? Anyone? 22 cents per gallon is when you fill up your car with unleaded. If you adjust it for the CDOT construction cost index, you get the blue line. And so the vertical line is where we are now. That gap in purchasing power is why the roads suck. Okay? We'll just be very blunt. 140 characters worth of thought. Okay? So what's backfilled this a little bit during this time is the general fund over about 20 years has pumped in about $2 billion into CDOT. And then now a long time ago, 2009, the state passed a registration fee increase called the FASTER law. And that's been generating about $300 million a year, and some of it is shared locally. But over the long run, this idea that the users of the highway system should pay for it has somehow been lost. Across the country, well over 20 states have adjusted their sales taxes or gas taxes to deal with this phenomenon because the price of asphalt and concrete goes up, fuel efficiency has been improving, and so what you're getting out of a per gallon gas tax is just not the same. And so we drive on the roads, we leave them outside at night, and this gas tax is not doing its job like it was before. So in Colorado, the way to fix this is not to complain to your legislators. You have to complain to Kelly Brough, who is going to talk about the Citizens Initiative and the ballot strategy that we need, because we have to ask the voters to raise the gas tax. The legislature can't do it. So that's the end of my remarks. We have our state demographer next, I believe, to talk about some of the demographic issues that are affecting our economic situation. And then we have what I think will be an interesting panel for everybody for the rest of the session. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
All right, we're going to see if those slides, perfect. All right, again, my name is Elizabeth Garner. I'm the state demographer for Colorado, and what I'm going to be talking about is kind of then where does the population fit into some of these changes that we're seeing across the state and that kind of relationship with the state budget. I'm hoping I'm doing this right. Perfect. So in order to understand where we are, I thought I'd start with some base data. Understanding that the U.S. population really does influence where Colorado is and Colorado's population, because obviously we're a piece of the whole. The US is at about 325 million people. We increase annually right around that 2 million people, an increase of about 0.7%. And this last year, between 16 and 17, is actually the slowest growth rate that the US has experienced since the Great Depression. And I know a lot of you are thinking, especially if you were trying to drive here this morning, you're like, really? I don't feel like it's slower. But it is, in fact, and just the change in terms of absolute change between the 2 years, about a 70,000 person slowdown in that increase for the US as a whole. Colorado's at about 5.6 million people. We were the 9th fastest growing state this last year between 16 and 17 at 1.4%. The years previous to that, we were 7th and then 2nd. So we've definitely slowed down relative to other states. We were 8th in total growth, increasing a little over 77,000. Again, a slowdown compared to some recent history. But big picture, we've increased by about 578,000 people since 2010, and all of you will agree that's a lot of folks. But I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're increasing and where does that fit into the big picture. One of the things that I think is actually most interesting of the growth since 2010 is that 95% of it has been along the Front Range, which definitely deviates from history, where only about 84% of the total growth occurred across the Front Range. And so if we look at a map of the state, all of the red, orange, yellow areas are counties that have increased in population since 2010. All of the shades of blue are counties that have declined in population since 2010. So we can see this strong growth along the I-25 corridor. And so one of the questions I think we'll get to in the panel discussion is, how does that feel? Is that something that we could be looking at strategically as a state? Are there ways that we can leverage relationships between the Front Range and other parts of the state to continue our economic prosperity, but potentially leverage some of the areas that maybe aren't growing as fast and may have excess resources available in terms of labor force or housing that might make us more prosperous as a state as a whole? Something that we can look at. But then there's this allocation of resources, looking at, is that the best way to manage water? Is that the best way to manage transportation? So I know that there's a lot of factors in there. I think it's really important to talk about the total growth in the state, and I know I am probably giving you death by PowerPoint, but it's just the way I operate. If we look at total population change in this chart, it's the complete bar. It's the blue part plus the red part. The blue part is what we call natural increase. This is births minus deaths. So real quick, in your mind, you should be thinking those are babies, because again, it's births minus deaths. So these are not drivers. They are not homeowners. They are babies. The red component is net migration. Those are the ins minus the outs. And if we look over time, and if I do this right up here, this line is the 100,000 mark. If we look back in 1970, we reached 100,000 change once, 5% annual average growth rate. In the 1990s, we hit that 100,000 mark 7 years. Since 2001, we have not hit 100,000 in terms of total population change. Yet, you hear many conversations talking about unprecedented growth. And I'm like, short-term memory loss? No. That, in the 90s, was potentially unprecedented population growth or accelerated population growth. But actually, we're right about average right now in terms of our population growth. The other piece that I'm going to mention is that in the blue component, which is the natural increase, you start to see that sliding down. It is less of a share of our total population change. Why is that? Fewer babies, more deaths. Not that there's like a huge plague hitting the state that we didn't know about. We're aging, and we've got a larger share of our population in ages that tend to die. But all of you that might be in business, and definitely Kelly and Henry looking at this, should be thinking to themselves, really? Slow down in births? That means my potential labor supply is also slowing down. And that's one of the big things to be thinking about as we talk about population growth into the future. People often get blamed a lot for things. Oh, those dang people. They're on the roads, they're using services. But what are people? People are jobs. And when people move to the Colorado, it's because of job growth. And we can look at this chart and see the relationship. The blue bars are net job growth, the red line is net migration. So I love the title of this conference in being balanced, is that when people start talking about, oh, we need to limit people, my first question is, okay, you're ready to limit job growth? Nothing against you, Kelly, at all. But are we really willing to look at this balance between our natural environment, water, housing, population, and jobs, and understand that it is a big picture? And not only people as a whole, but people by different age groups. Henry kind of alluded to it, but one of the biggest things that we're starting to see is this aging in the population and the impact that it's going to have on different programs. Well, as you'll notice in this chart, we see that migration in the red line is above job growth. And a lot of you might be thinking to yourself, why? Why are we going to do that? Because we're aging. People are going to be aging out of the labor force at 3 times the rate that we were in the year 2000 as in the year in 2020, 2025. We're going to have a demand for workers so strong that we're going to need migration to be faster than job growth just to keep up. And a lot of times we don't think about that. We just think about, ooh, they're on I-25 and I-70, which I definitely have a problem with that as well, but we need to think about that balance. And we can see this correlation between jobs and population growth in this map of the state as well. If we're looking at job growth since the year pre-recession peak levels to current, all of the shades of blue are counties that have reached back to pre-recession peak levels of employment. All of the shades of red, orange, yellow are counties that are not back to pre-recession peak levels of employment. And this is as of the annual average 2016. We don't have all of 17 in yet. And we can see that this looks very, very similar to the map of population change, so we can see this correlation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know it's probably really hard to see. What I want you to be thinking about, though, is where are we growing jobs? This looks at job growth by industry. The top growth area for the state as an industry is what? Health services. Is there any wonder why? Our aging population, our 65-plus population, is growing by 6% per year. Our total population is increasing by 1.4%. When we age, things start to wear down. We need a new hip, maybe a knee. Maybe we get sick. But this is what's driving the fact that our top employment generator is in health services. I also broke it down by color coding. The orange colors are job areas that pay less than 80% of the annual weekly wage. The purple color is kind of between 80 and 120% of average weekly wage, so we would call it average wage. The green are industries that pay above average weekly wage, so they're at the above 120%. Where have we been growing jobs? Tends to be a lot of areas that have either low-income jobs or average income jobs. And so that's important to be thinking about, because as we're looking at this balance between jobs, people, the natural environment, do we need to be very cognizant of what types of jobs are we growing? And of course, where are we growing them? But understanding that we drive a lot of that job growth. Unless something super cool happens and I don't get sick and need a new knee, great, then maybe we'll put a little bit of downward pressure on that health service growth. But if we keep aging like we always have, that could be areas that will continue to see growth. So just to tie things up, I'm going to be talking about the fact that growth is really slowing. I showed you that one slide earlier where we're seeing job growth starting to slow down. And why are we seeing job growth slowing down in Colorado? Not because we're not cool anymore, but because we're also seeing that the U.S. job growth is also starting to slow. What is one of the largest constraints in the U.S. job growth? Labor force. Available labor force is one of the largest constraints in the United States as well as in Colorado that is keeping a little bit of damper on job growth. And this chart shows where we're seeing that this is our forecast out into the future. Again, the blue component is natural increase, the red component is net migration, where we're forecasting this slowing, and that potentially 2015 may have been our peak population change that we're forecasting out through 2050. And in fact, by 2050, or actually between 2040 and 2050, our annual average growth rate for Colorado is going to be somewhere between 8 and 9% in terms of our population change. And so it's interesting to think about how we're slowing, because I'm sure none of you, and yesterday I was up in North Front Range, they certainly didn't believe me whatsoever that population is slowing down. When we forecast total population into the future, it is this concept of balance. We're looking at job growth, and we're looking at the people to fill those jobs. We look at those industries that are in Colorado, how they're forecast to grow nationally, and then we grow them likewise. But we also look at you all. We look at our total population and who can fill those jobs. We look at how likely you are to participate in the labor force. And we take that and we move that forward. So even though we're forecasting a slowing rate, we're still forecasting the state to continue to increase. We're at about 5.6 million people right now, forecast to increase to about 7.8 million by 2040 and about 8.5 million by 2050. And I know you're thinking to yourself, all right, Elizabeth, you said slower, that doesn't seem slower. You're right. It doesn't seem slower, but it is slower. But it is about 3 million more people forecast to increase between 2015 and 2050. Of that 3 million, we're forecasting 2.5 million along the Front Range. Woohoo, right? You're like, oh man, bummer. 2.5 million along the Front Range, about 660,000 up north, about 440,000 down south in the South Front Range of El Paso and Pueblo, with about 500,000 in the remaining part of the state. But just like Henry said, we kind of don't know what we don't know. We don't know what those risk factors are. I mean, we know what they are, but we don't know what their impacts are going to be. Certainly, water is one of the constraints and one of the factors that we look at all of the time in terms of, well, what about water? Yes, we look at water and we work with water suppliers, we work with local governments in terms of understanding where is water as a constraint. We also don't know what's going to happen nationally. Right now, there is a huge constraint on international migration. If that stays intact, we can definitely continue to see a slowing growth rate for the U.S. as a whole. If it opens up, we could actually see more people. So we don't know what that policy is going to be. Housing, infrastructure, state budget, all will impact whether people choose Colorado as a place to live and work. Aging is a huge component of what the state is also going to be facing. As I'd mentioned before, we're going to have a huge number of leavers from the labor force. One of the big policy questions that we may also talk about is How do we make sure that every Coloradoan is ready and able to work in these jobs that we're making vacated? I mean, the best way to slow down in-migration is to potentially make sure that all of the Coloradoans are ready to fill all of the jobs. So could we actually look at policies that may improve allocation of resources just by making sure our kiddos are ready to be our next generation of workers? Likewise, we could see a huge impact from changes in industries. The Great Recession decreased our forecast by over 600,000 people out in 2050. Our 2050 forecast was over 9 million prior to the Great Recession. So that can dampen and change what happens to our population forecast because, again, this balance between jobs and people. Likewise, natural resources could be a huge indicator or huge impact. Our biggest trading partners in terms of population, California, Texas, Florida. Fires, floods, hurricanes. Bummer. Any Californians, Texans, or Floridians out there that will admit it? Come on. No one? Man, tough crowd. But since these are our largest trading partners, is it possible that we could actually attract more people from those states or less people leave Colorado to go to those states? So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Henry to moderate this next session. These were just some concluding marks, but I think what's more important is to see what we're going to be talking about. Thank you.
Hopefully this works. Great. Thank you. So one of the strategies in life is surround yourself with people smarter than you. So I am pursuing that strategy this morning. And we have a great panel to talk about some of these issues. And so we had a call before being with you today. And so we thought an interesting question might be, given the rules we have, the economic conditions that we have, what mix of policy changes will create a brighter future, assuming there's a consensus on the word brighter, or a different or a better trajectory, whatever those mean to you. What mix of policy changes need an adjustment? And I think we have kind of everyone works on a diverse part of the Colorado economy or Colorado program on our panel today. And so, Christian, would you like to lead us off?
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I'm Christian Race. I'm the executive director of Club 20, so we are all of Western Colorado. And it's really a mixed bag in Western Colorado. When we talk about policy changes that will unite the state, I think it's, not to be disingenuous, but it's kind of like wishing for rainbows and butterflies to fly all over the place, because the reality is that we have a pretty significant cultural difference between rural Colorado and urban Colorado. And I think that we need to focus more on furthering the understanding of those differences, talking more about what rural Colorado provides to urban Colorado and what urban Colorado provides for rural Colorado, and understanding those differences so that we're not such a divided state. Certainly, efforts like transportation funding would be helpful in all of our regions, and there's a need in the Denver metro area, there's a need in rural Colorado. It's all over the state. We have a $9 billion Tier 1 project list that hasn't been funded, and a lot of need throughout this state. I think one thing we're really seeing in Western Colorado is, as you saw with some of the slides, we've had a huge loss of jobs in the region. Since the downturn in 2009 in Mesa County alone, we've lost over 10,000 oil and gas jobs. 10,000 oil and gas jobs. That's in one county. When you look at our mining communities in Craig and in Delta, the job loss that they've experienced would be comparable to losing 20% of the jobs in Denver. Can you imagine the headlines that would be made if Denver lost 20% of their jobs? It'd make national news, but it doesn't in Western Colorado because it's just what we work through and what we deal with. So any regulations, any bills that could be put into place that would let businesses work, let them operate without some of these really costly regulations to comply with. Certainly creating a career and workforce ready set of students who are graduating from high school. We've been focusing a lot on career and technical education in Western Colorado because not all jobs need a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. You can have a really high-paying, fulfilling job with a certificate, with a training program in advanced manufacturing and technology. And so those are some of the areas that we've been focusing on. Certainly, as you saw with the slides from our wonderful state demographer, we have challenges and we have a net migration out of our communities. And so we're trying to figure out how that change really impacts our local economies and how we can be more resilient to anticipate some of those as we move forward into the future.
Thank you. Should we go around? Ann Terry?
Well, thank you. Local governments are all over the state of Colorado, whether they're on the Front Range, the Eastern Plains, north, south, east, west, or over on the western slope. But I think when you look at history, and I'm not going to dig too deep into history, but if you go ancient history, Romans all the way up to modern history, our successful societies and our successful governments have been ones where we've had balance, where we've looked at balance. And balance does not always mean equal. And I think Elizabeth said it really well when she talked about, well, are we going to leverage these relationships? Are we going to leverage these resources? How do we do that? That's Kelly's job, to figure some of those pieces out. But when you're looking at balance, are you looking at balance because you think it needs to be equal? And I would submit to you all, it does not mean equal or even equitable, but it means figuring out how to make that work wherever you are. So looking at funding, proper, efficient funding. How do we do that? Water issues. We have a water plan. How do we continue to fund this water plan? Are we going to continue to fund this water plan? Does the plan need to be updated? What does that look like? I was talking to some folks earlier that were talking about the piece around the forecasting for 2019, what our water resources would be like. So, what is our water going to be like? How are we going to use our water efficiently and collaboratively around the Front Range, especially if we're going to have increased population? We know we're going to have increased population. How are we going to fund these projects? And I know Kelly's going to talk a little bit about this, but the residential assessment ratio is a big topic for government, local government. The panelists this morning were asked a question, and they talked briefly about it, but what I would submit to you is that, yes, conversations are happening all over the state. We're actually leaving at noon to go have one with some of the county commissioners. Our fire districts are having these conversations. The cities are having these conversations. Other special districts are having these conversations. The business community is having this conversation. Talk about inequity and lack of balance in what the Gallagher Amendment has created for us. But how are we going to continue working with the ratio and the equation that we have? I think that we're going to be looking at some changes. How do we get the state to want to be a part of those changes? How do we get the voters to understand that we will have a better growing economy, better growing jobs, have diverse jobs? That's another really good point here. As we look at what we have the ability to hold in the state, is where do we put folks and what kind of jobs do we need? Not everybody is going to go to college. Not everybody should go to college. Some folks would do much better, and especially in some of our water plants, our water certification programs, that we're working with our water districts to see how we can help them get the workforces that they need. We're looking at some new recruiting programs. Also, and I'd be totally remiss if I didn't talk about collaborating with our private partners, collaborating with our local government partners, and collaborating among ourselves in the water provider world. Do we unify? Do we consolidate? Unification is the new fancy word for consolidating. Fire districts did consolidations really well. It was painful at first, and probably is a little bit still painful. But do we have water districts that can consolidate, work together to provide better services and better water to the communities of our state? So those are some of the things that we're looking at, and I could not conclude if I didn't say we all, in our planning and our balance, looking at our civility. How do we work well together? How do we respect one another's differences? And how do we come together to figure out what we can collaborate on and build on? So thanks.
Thank you. It's pretty civil on the internet, so that's good. Kelly Brough, frame some of the issues as you see them. And it must be a burden to be the entire adult supervision of the state. So walk us through how you see this equation working out for the state.
Yeah, so I think, Henry, you started with a question of what are the policy changes, that we have to address. This is the sad part. I think it'd be easier to answer the question, what don't we have to change? We've gotten ourselves in a bit of a mess in Colorado. So the one I'm going to start with is our board of directors has looked at this issue of our Constitution, and the belief that you could put a formula in our Constitution and it could govern our state for over 30 years and make the right decision every time, what we know today is it's absolutely not true. So one of the first changes I think we would say we have to do as a state is we have to take formulas out of our Constitution. The reason this is such a bad strategy is it pisses everybody off, because let me remind you what the formulas are in your Constitution. They're things like the Gallagher split, which puts huge impact on business. But when residential, people who own residential property understand it, they tend to kind of love it. But it is incredibly unstrategic and unthoughtful policy because the cost of government really is around residential needs, not business and commercial. Another formula is your Tabor formula, not the right to vote on a tax increase, but the formula that says here's when you refund, here's when you keep it, has nothing to do with what the needs are, the priorities, outside factors. Another formula would be the growth in your K-12 educational system, automatic formula that determines how much you put in instead of a state making those determinations. We're the only state in the country that thought, even if it was at the time seemed smart, putting formulas in your Constitution that you could never change would be a good idea to govern when the world is changing at the pace we are. So the first thing I'd say is our board has taken a position, all formulas out of the Constitution, even if we offend everybody in Colorado, that we have to get back in the business of governing our own state. A second area that I think we're at great risk is our own workforce and the development of our workforce. Colorado's on track to require the most educated workforce in the country. In 2 years, 2020, which I can't believe is only 2 years away, 74% of our jobs in Colorado will require post-secondary completion. So these are apprenticeship, 2-year degrees, certificates, 4-year degrees, and we are nowhere near producing a population who meets that. The only thing that has saved us is the in-migration that Elizabeth was talking about, because they're bringing degrees to Colorado and helping us meet those workforce needs. But you can't invest in higher ed, 48 out of 50th in the country, and expect that our kids and their families are going to figure out how to get there. And we have institutions throughout the state who are doing amazing work. I'll give a plug to Colorado Mesa University, which I'm on the board of trustees. Amazing and critical work that will transform Grand Junction to be able to compete effectively with Salt Lake City, which is exactly what we should all be working toward. A third area that we've been talking about is transportation. That we're the only state. You look at a state like Utah, they've raised their gas tax twice. They increased a sales tax. They did it at their legislature, probably one of the most conservative legislatures in the country. And they did it because they said, this will make us more competitive. They're absolutely right. It does make them very competitive. And a risk we have in this state is our failure to invest in our transportation, but frankly, all of our infrastructure. And this is where you'd put water as well. And we're in the billions in all of those categories of what we have to address and take on. What strikes me as we're working on a transportation initiative this year to figure out how do we truly fund all transportation needs for Colorado is that water, education, I heard prisons testify the other day about their need for funding, higher education, not just K-12, that it's not about picking and choosing which is the most important. It is about saying, when does a window present, and how do we make sure our voters in Colorado get the chance to say, I want more funding for something. And I think when it comes to water, one of the things we have to do collectively throughout the state is help people understand what you all know so well, and that is how critical water is, and that we must make these investments for all of our future to be successful together. I'll stop there.
Wow. Do we have time for audience questions? I hope so. 25 minutes. Do you have enough questions for 25 minutes? So, given what you've heard today, what's on your mind to clear up or have us know about? And I can't quite see.
Okay, hang on.
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Doug.
Hi. From an infrastructure perspective, it's more cost-effective to serve the population centers, and so it seems like what's ultimately going to happen is that it's going to take only the wealthier people can live in the rural areas. What's your take on that? Does that sound like the way things are going?
Are you saying that when there's a fixed amount of money, the bias is towards where there's the most? Is that? I want to make sure we answer the right question.
No, it's easier, it's less costly per person
Oh.
to serve the population centers, and so it seems like more and more of the rural areas are going to be higher in a cost per person basis to live in those places. So it seems like it's going to naturally drive people into the population centers over time.
It's an interesting question. So I'll talk about two formulas, and then I think we should go around. So one formula in the state is the K through 12 financing formula. And if you look at where the big districts, the average per pupil isn't really that different. It might vary by 3 or 4% per kid. But if you go out in the rural areas, the dollar amount per student is much higher, and it reflects the dynamic you're talking about. But the formula does try to equalize it because they adjust for size and so forth. In transportation, the formula that has been working at least moderately well is 60% of the gas tax stays with the state CDOT department, and 40% gets split with local governments. 18% cities, 22% counties, and Ann will punch me if that's not correct. So we've tried to incorporate some structural formulas, the state of Colorado, over a long period of time, to try to account for there are needs everywhere, and to make sure we share back when people are contributing to the big pot. So I'll stop there, but I think let's go around and comment.
Sure. To piggyback off of the formula portion there, we do receive some funds in rural Colorado to build out our roads, and I would say that our roads aren't as heavily used as the roads in the metro areas, and so the wear and tear on them, piece by piece comparison is probably not the same. What I would tell you we've observed most recently are a lot of folks from the Denver metro area, from Colorado Springs, who are tired of the population growth, who are selling their houses for millions of dollars and buying a $300,000 house in western Colorado and bringing their wealth with them. And so certainly we have, it is a little more expensive when you look at those kinds of things to live in rural Colorado, but I think when you look at the types of people who live in rural Colorado, they're willing to pay a little bit more to be away from the population. And again, we're seeing a lot of folks retiring and moving into our communities that bring wealth with them.
Your question makes me think about how important policy is about how we raise money to address our needs in the state of Colorado. And if we approach, I think our greatest risk as a state is that we start to approach it as if each local area is responsible for the cost, whether it's education or transportation or water. If you said to every basin, you figure out how to raise the money you need for water, many of the basins would say there's just no possible way that our population can manage that. The same is true for transportation. I think what is required to make sure that we recognize that we are going to have subsidization. So I'll give you an example. As we work on transportation, there are a lot of awful funding opportunities, right? We could raise your income tax or your property tax. I assure you, don't worry, nobody's considering that. Don't panic. Because Coloradans hate those taxes. But one of the taxes that's being discussed is sales tax. Now, why would sales tax be discussed? One of the reasons is because the majority of sales tax is raised in the metro area, about 60%, 59%. And yet only about 41% of that sales tax will come back to the metro area. And it's a recognition by this population center that we have an obligation to solve this problem as a state and to distribute that money to ensure that the burden is not unduly expected of rural Colorado to go it alone. And my fear is if we do not together figure out how to accomplish those kinds of approaches to funding infrastructure, you will see regions break free, raise their own taxes, solve the problem in their region, and then we are in a huge challenge for our state residents to figure out who can afford to live here, to educate their kids, provide health care coverage, cover their transportation needs, invest in their water. It will never happen. And so this notion of a divide between urban and rural, we should dedicate ourselves. And I promise you at the Denver Metro Chamber, we do it every single day. Our board of directors said, we go statewide to solve everything, and we solve it so it works for the state. Otherwise, it is exactly the problem I think you present.
Thanks.
You know, I think that you bring up a really good point, and I think historically it has been more efficient to serve concentrations of population. But I think, you know, Kelly brought out some really good points, is that the way we want to operate as a state? And I think besides looking at transportation, that the state is currently already looking at, for example, broadband infrastructure, that looking at how do we light up all of the state so that folks, Western Slope, Eastern Plains, San Luis Valley, all have equal opportunity, not only in education for the students, but also business opportunities. Because as the Front Range becomes more and more expensive to operate in, even as a business, you know, I think a lot of us want to be able to look at these other regional centers, whether they're maybe Pueblo or Grand Junction, as these areas that we can operate. And if we don't invest in that, then we are really, you know, not utilizing the state resources like we should. One area which it would be interesting to see if there's going to be any direction in it within the next couple of years, Kelly brought up labor force. Labor force is so huge. And Christian brought up labor force. Question is, what about childcare? What we're trying to do is get everybody into the labor force, everybody prepared and work. Wherever you go around the state, one of the top 5 issues that people come up with is affordable and accessible childcare. Because they can't go to work if they don't have someone helping out with the kids. So I think that that's another area that we need to look at strategically across the state. What type of investments can we make into childcare? What kind of potentially burdensome regulations exist? What are some policies that we can look at statewide that would make it easier in the Denver metro area, where it's tough to find childcare, as well as anywhere else around rural Colorado?
Cool, thank you. Ann?
Well, the best part about going last is I can just say ditto, and that works. However, I think one of the things that your question brings up, and I'm going to beat this drum again, and as I've told my members, we will fall on this sword and die on this sword, but the Gallagher Amendment, the residential assessment rate in more of the rural or less metro area is choking those communities even more so, and the value of your homes are not going up in the same rate that they are going up in other parts of Colorado, whether it's a resort community or a more metro community. So, you know, that is a big piece of it. So ditto to what my panelists said, but however, Kelly brought up a really good point. We need to have this conversation and this communication and this collaboration as a whole state, not as in regions, and to come together to solve these problems together. Whether they get solved at the State House, I would tell you they're most likely going to get solved in your communities with these broader conversations, in your smaller local governments, because you're feeling that particular pain or you're feeling those particular pressures.
So I think I see a question right in the left center. Sir?
Didn't see it.
Oh, no?
Now we're center
Okay,
center.
now dead center. Okay, great.
Thank you. A question for the whole panel, building on Kelly, thank you for your comment. Building on that comment of sweeping everything out of the Constitution that has a formula, to which I say, huzzah, but how? With Tabor enjoying popularity, with government bumping along the bottom of its popularity polls, how do we get government back in the position to govern? What are the positions from your respective organizations regarding Tabor and the other elements of the Constitution that include the formulas I would like to join you in sweeping out of the Constitution?
So you want us to know how we do this?
Yes,
Oh
please.
my gosh. I have no idea. The next question. We have done a lot of research on with voters in Colorado on these issues, and one thing is clear is when we all voted on Tabor, what most people thought they were voting on is the right to vote on a tax increase. And most people didn't understand the complexity of the formulas, which is probably why I think something like 86% of local governments have removed those formulas from, in some manner in Colorado. We've never done that in the state. So for us at the Chamber, when we talk about this issue, we're really talking about the formula, not the right to vote on a tax increase. I want to clarify that piece. You can remove those things through a simple vote of the people. You can still do that even after we passed Raise the Bar. So with a simple majority, you could just remove those formulas and leave the rest, or remove the section. In Gallagher, it'd be the whole thing. But as you point out, that's really challenging to do. So you basically have two choices, right? We convince voters to help understand the risk of not taking them out and see if we could pass it at a ballot going together. And the other one is a constitutional convention, which probably makes this room more nervous than any other room in Colorado. And we're included in that, but where you really try to clean up the whole Constitution in one place. But there's high risk there too. But there's no other, right? It is our Constitution. So the only way we get to do this is we help Coloradans understand the risk we're putting our future in by not addressing these issues.
So this morning, one of the legislators, it might have been Representative Becker, said, well, it's going to take a catastrophic event for us to make any of these changes. I would prefer not to see that happen. Henry was around during the C&D campaigns, and we all said that something catastrophic will happen if we don't do this. I agree with Kelly. Formulas do not belong in the Constitution. That's just my personal belief. But very few people actually understand what they are, how they work. I was reviewing the residential assessment ratio calculation, and I'm pretty sure I know the quadratic equation better. Because it was like 5 different, take this times percentage of, divide by, and you get. How do you explain that? We have to be able to educate our voters why putting stuff that is so detailed into the Constitution is a bad idea and taking it out is a good idea. Again, not taking out the intent, not taking out the abilities to vote on taxes, but taking out the complicated pieces of it. You can't have this conversation in an elevator. You can't have this conversation at your neighbor's house when somebody is coming around and talking about why we should vote no on something or why we should vote yes on something. So before we get to that catastrophic event, I would hope that we can start having very educated conversations so that we can take the messages out even further. People in this room understand it. They know how it works. They want to make sure that we have water, that we have transportation, that we have good roads, that we have good education. And in order to do that, we all have to learn how to have that conversation with the rest of the state.
Yeah, and from Club 20's perspective, for some of you, I know there's quite a few members in the room, our friend Ricky Santorelli has been trying to convene a constitutional convention for years now to try to clean things up, and that hasn't happened. So we have supported Representative Thurlow's bill that he ran last year to look at the Tabor calculation and try to come up with a calculation that's more reflective of the actual economic conditions on the ground. I believe he will be running that again this year, but that certainly is not removing that formula. It's looking at a new calculation. With Gallagher and Amendment 23 and the negative factor, I think whenever we talk about opening these formulas up, there's always a fear that rural Colorado is going to get the short end of the stick. And is it better for us to just get what we're getting now instead of opening this up and then potentially losing revenue that we currently get from some of those formulas? So there certainly needs to be a much harder look at many of these formulas, and actually that's the theme of our spring conference this year, is looking at Tabor, Gallagher, and Amendment 23, and trying to come up with some solutions to figure out how we can start taking bites at this elephant to start making the state of Colorado less of a Gordian knot with our fiscal situation.
Great. We have 3 minutes. Ann is helping me. So one quick last question. There you go.
A quick question.
Yes, sir.
You talked about the gap between road construction costs and income coming in from the gasoline
God
tanks.
bless you for listening, sir.
What needs to happen to close that gap? How much are we talking about?
Right. If we were to close the gap in the purchasing power of the gas tax, on the chart that we saw, it's almost doubling the gas tax. So from 22 cents a gallon to 44 cents a gallon. That's not going to fly. So people in the business community have invested in polling data. And I think the gas tax is kind of viewed like a tax on your life. I don't think people feel like they do a lot of optional driving. It's mostly for work or school and getting around. So the shot of infusing new dollars into transportation, to the extent you were persuaded the general fund is not going to be a good consistent place for it, is this sales tax. And that seems to have some tolerance with the voters. But mathematically, what it would take to get to just a user fee purchasing power to where we used to be would be 22 cents a gallon. We appreciate all your questions. We hope this was informative. Through Doug, you can get in touch with us if you need more information or the slides, if they're not part of the program that goes out. I'm happy to provide mine. Also, we all have different websites you can access and see what more content is interesting to you. But hopefully your conference goes well. We appreciate your questions and kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you to Henry and our panelists.